Now you may very well be tempted to spunk up the best part of $1,000 on a Samsung Galaxy or an iPhone or something just because they've got some pretty shit-hot camera tech. But these days most mid-range mobiles come packing some pretty decent optics. Cameras that are good enough for snapping your everyday existence and capturing some gorgeous 4K footage of your cats and kids generally buggering about. Now I've personally tested and reviewed tons of more affordable handsets, so here's my pick of the best budget-friendly camera phones you can grab yourself right now in 2023. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, please do subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! So if photography is a priority for you, then one of the absolute best mid-range options right now is Google's Pixel 7a. It may sport a placky back, but the Pixel 7a still looks lush and is proper water resistant, with the metal frame and camera bump plus this charming light blue colour option. That display is a G-OLED panel where the G most likely stands for Goosh. It's bright, poppy and HDR10 certified, while the stereo speakers spaff out some decent audio. The Pixel 7a is powered by Google's Tensor G2, just like the Pixel 7 and 7 Pro. So this mini mobile doesn't shit the bed when you slap up the graphics settings in Genshin Impact. And what you have here is a 64 megapixel Sony IMX787 sensor, never before stuffed inside of a Pixel phone, or any other phones at all pretty much, besides the ZTE Accent 40 blowers from last year. Google's Pixel camera app is based around simplicity. It's very easy to get to grips with, ideal for anyone who wants a point-and-shoot stress-free experience. And as I think pretty much anyone would expect now from a Google smartphone, the Pixel 7a pumps out good-looking snaps complete with natural colour tones, helped along by Google's not inconsiderable processing smarts. My biggest complaint in week one is that the Pixel 7a's focus can, on rare occasions, but occasions all the same, decide that it simply can't be arsed. Still, even when you are moving and shooting, the Pixel 7a's quick shutter speed produces some surprisingly sharp photos, even when you're using that portrait mode. And speaking of which, the portrait chops are decent here, even dealing quite well with crazy windswept hair, while adding a lovely bokeh style blur to wipe out the background. That sensor copes pretty well in more ambient conditions, capturing a pretty sharp image, as long as your hands and your subject are reasonably still. Although once again the focus does occasionally to the bed, so you might want to snap a couple of shots just in case. And in very low light, the Pixel 7a still puts up a pretty good fight, although you do get considerable noise creeping in, as with pretty much every mid-range rival. At any point you can also swap to the secondary lens here on the Pixel 7a, which is a basic 13 megapixel ultra-wide angle shooter. This is another IMX special, so photos shot with this are quite consistent, once again producing natural tones if not quite as much detail. And yes, it does stumble a little harder in low light. And no, there's no telephoto lens on here, as you would expect from a mid-range mobile. It does max out at 8 times digital zoom. And who doesn't love a bit of extreme close-up Veronica action? You've got a few different modes you can play around with, including the likes of the portrait mode, of course. You've got the night sight mode, which does automatically activate in that auto setting anyway. Long exposure, which I still think is utter balls. And then if you go into modes, you've got a couple of extra bits, but that's it. No dedicated pro mode, for instance, similar to the iPhones. And if you prance your way into the video mode, you see you've got a choice of either Full HD or 4K resolution. And even at the 4K level, you can swap it up to 60 frames per second. Although at 4K 60 FPS, you can't use the speech enhancement feature, which basically just highlights your vocals. And I found when it came to shooting video, the Pixel 7a is certainly fine, if not remarkable. Visuals are reasonably crisp as long as the lighting doesn't suck. The focus occasionally pops, but nothing too horrendous. And in fact, the audio capture is really good. Vocals are clearly picked up in all directions with a proper surround sound effect when you're watching your footage back. And then last up for the camera tech here on the Pixel 7a is that 13 megapixel front-facing shooter. And it's okay-ish. It's not the worst, but it is pretty bog standard stuff, producing soft snaps in dimmer light. You can only expect crispy detail-packed pics when the lighting is ideal and you keep perfectly still. And using the Pixel 7a's front-facing camera, you can shoot up to 4K resolution footage, which is pretty good because a lot of these phones top off at Full HD resolution. You've got a speech enhancement feature which can help to focus on your voice when there's lots of other background clamour going on, quite handy if you are vlogging outdoors. Another cracking choice is the Nothing Phone 1, which may have stolen headlines with its flashy disco arse, but it's actually a solid all-rounder for a similar price to the Pixel. It's got impressive game and grunt, a similar stock Android vibe, and some capable camera tech headed up by Sony's IMX766 sensor, which is found in an awful bloody lot of 2022 smartphones. And more often than not, this does a great job, although some of my recent pics on the Nothing phone still occasionally look rather soft, as if the focus didn't quite get its shit together in time. The Nothing phone handles HDR situations well, capturing a good amount of detail in darker areas without blowing out the lighter bits. And a bright blue sky will often look exactly that rather than washed out. And likewise, I haven't seen any kind of lens flare or any other bugger about battery when I've been shooting in harsh lighting. The Nothing phone is also a blinder when it comes to portrait shots, even when you're dealing with fast moving subjects. Although weirdly, it now seems to take a wee while to process some portrait snaps, remaining completely unresponsive until it's all done. And that's something I didn't notice at all when the phone was first released, so maybe it's been introduced by one of these little updates. The Nothing phone sadly doesn't perform as admirably in lower light despite the optical image stabilization. You'll see plenty of grain and noise creeping into your pics, not to mention blur with any kind of motion, despite claimed improvements in this area. And that focus definitely struggles more in lower light too. I often had to manually override it with a poke of the screen. Still, you've always got the option to absolutely blind your subject with those glyphs if you want to light the buggers up. The 50meg ultra-wide angle lens uses Samsung's GN1 sensor, and you'll get some distortion around the edges of your photos and the usual color morphing, but the actual picture quality is almost as good as any images taken with the main sensor. This is more prone to saturation in brighter light and not as capable in dimmer conditions, but it is still one of the better ultra-wide shooters at this price point. Video can be recorded at up to 4K resolution, although if you do stick it on that Ultra HD level, you are stuck at 30 frames per second, there's no 60 FPS option. For the first week or two that I spent with this smartphone, all of my footage looked almost cartoon-like thanks to the artificial colour boost, but thankfully one of these updates has sorted the problem right out, and now the Nothing phone captures more natural look in action. Image stabilization is good enough to work against any shakes and bumps if you're moving and recording simultaneously, and audio capture is perfectly respectable, as long as there's no actual wind or anything. You could also use the ultra-wide camera to shoot video, but you'll have to select this before you start recording, as you can't switch midway through, and again the results are fine as long as the conditions aren't taxing. Up front you've got a 16meg Sony sensor for your selfie shots, and again this is pretty good even in quite strong light. You'll get plenty of detail packed into every pic, no masking of those lines and creases at all, and the portrait smarts are also up to snuff, although like the main camera things do get soft in lower light. Next, let's have a wee squint at Samsung, and while last year's Galaxy A53 smartphone was a juddery letdown, the fresh new Galaxy A54 makes amends with the redesigned Exynos 1380 chipset. This can cope with some sweaty gaming action, no worries, while that One UI experience is satisfyingly smooth, and it looks really rather ruddy stunning on that poppy as you like AMOLED display. Battery life is good enough for over 6 hours of screen on time per charge, even with lots of audio streaming in the background. Although the Samsung Galaxy A54 does peak at 25 watt wired charging, and as usual there's no adapter bundled in the box. And one of the other updates is the all new 50meg camera sensor, now bigger than ever for improved low light photography allegedly, plus some of that hot optical image stabilization. Unfortunately, my testing of the Galaxy A54's optics didn't get off to the most illustrious of starts, as I realised that the shutter speed wasn't particularly swift. So if you're attempting to shoot a living subject that does not obey your orders, then expect lots of blurry snaps of them just as they're turning away or buggering right off. Still, if you do actually manage to time it right, you'll often get a great looking portrait snap, with the added bonus that you can piddle about with that background bokeh action after you've hit the shutter button. While colours aren't always naturally captured, I've got to give props to the A54 because my test photos were quite pleasing to the eye, even those shot with less than ideal lighting. If you're dealing with harsh contrast, it's rare to see any oversaturation here. The A54 spaffs out well balanced pics, even in the face of bright lighting. And in more ambient light, things don't get too soft. It's not until evening time that you'll get noise creeping in, although Samsung's night mode can help to brighten and sharpen things up a little. You will again struggle with moving subjects, however, ending up with blurry or disfigured pics like this. As well as the 50meg sensor, the A54 serves up a 12meg ultra-wide angle shooter that's basic but not particularly bad. It comes in handy if you want a different vibe or you're just trying to capture something absolutely effing massive. And that third lens is a 5meg macro shooter if you fancy a bit of extreme close-up action. And as always with Samsung smartphones, you've got a plethora of bonus camera modes, including the obligatory food mode if you like to snap pics of your dinner and post them online before cramming it into your face. And it certainly makes edible stuff look even tastier by boosting the tones and textures. And there's my own personal favourite, the fun mode, which is just so much darn fun that I might have just hemorrhaged from enjoying myself too much. Samsung Blows are usually reliable enough for your home movies as well, and if you swap to video mode you can shoot up to 4K Ultra HD footage at 30 frames per second. I was certainly happy enough. Again, at this sort of mid-range price point, does a great job, crisp visuals, clear audio pickup and respectable stabilisation. And last up is that 32 meg selfie shooter, which like the rear cam does a decent job in all kinds of lighting, complete with a screen flash feature for low light that mostly just blinds you. And if you want to shoot some video using that front-facing selfie cam, well, again, this tops off at 4K resolution, which is still surprisingly rare. For a mid-range mobile, a lot of them do top off at full HD. Again, the audio pickup's absolutely fine, and I had no troubles using the A54 for Skype and Zoom and all that online video shenanigans. And if you want to save a bit more cash, well, I'm currently in the process of reviewing Samsung's Galaxy A34, which does sport not quite as capable camera tech, but it still seems to be pretty bloody good for your everyday shenanigans, so stay tuned for that full review. Another affordable alternative is the Poco F5 or the Poco F5 Pro, a pair of MIUI mobiles that are proper well-specced. They may look nothing like each other, and the specs are decidedly different too, but they're still beefy enough to handle any Android games out there. Battery life is decent, charging speeds are nippy, and they both serve up another vibrant OLED screen and stereo speaker setup. Definitely check out my side-by-side Poco F5 versus Poco F5 Pro comparison to see which one might be best for you. The good news is that when it comes to the optics, these Poco Blows share the same camera hardware, although the shooting experience isn't quite identical. Now, it's the exact same camera app and camera UI on both. That said, there are some differences between the two. For instance, the Poco F5 Pro has proper eye focus and also motion tracking focus, which you don't get on the regular Poco F5. As you can see there, I can detect faces, however. Apart from that, it's very similar camera experience. The shutter speed, nice and nippy. And as you would imagine, there's not really any difference at all in the quality of the samples that I shot on the Poco F5 versus the F5 Pro. Both perfectly capable cameras, certainly when the lighting is decent, and in more ambient light, as long as your subject doesn't move around like an absolute mentalist, then it's all good too. I particularly like the portrait effects on the Poco F5 and the Poco F5 Pro. Nice bit of bokeh action, really helps your subject to stand out. And these phones didn't struggle with slightly trickier conditions like high contrast either. And definitely go check out my full Poco F5 Pro review for more on the photo quality. You'll see that the Poco F5 and the Pro have the same basic camera modes, including portrait mode and night mode. If you jump into more, you'll see the Pro does have a couple of bonus bits like dual video and movie effects. But both phones can capture full 64 megapixel images, and both boast a proper Pro mode where you can fiddle around with the ISO levels, the white balance, etc. Can't shoot in RAW unfortunately, but hey-ho. And you'll also spy some differences when it comes to shooting home movies, because you've got an HDR option here on the Poco F5 Pro, not available on the Poco F5. And if we jump into the resolution settings, you'll see that the Poco F5 Pro can shoot up to 8K resolution footage or 4K at 30 or 60 frames per second, whereas the regular Poco F5 does max out at 4K res at just 30 FPS. And again, when it came to the video chops, no real difference between the Poco F5 and the Poco F5 Pro besides the fact you've got that 8K resolution support. I found that the Poco F5 was just as capable when it came to shooting that 4K resolution footage. Visuals are sharp, you got bold colours as long as the lighting isn't cack again, and audio perfectly captured from all around for a perfect surround sound style effect. So yeah, overall, at this sort of price point, great stuff. And no difference when it comes to the selfie cam action here either, because once again it's a 16 megapixel front facing shooter on both the Poco F5 and the Pro. And this does the job absolutely fine for your everyday selfies. You want to share them online, even if you're shooting against a bright sky, or capturing yourself in the club or some other ambient environment where light is at a premium. It's all good. And the Poco F5, just like the Poco F5 Pro, maxes out at full HD resolution, no 4K shenanigans for that front facer, but you know, it's still absolutely fine if you want to do a bit of Skype and Zoom and whatever. Alternatively, the Poco X5 Pro is another well-specced option, packing a 108 meg Samsung HM2 sensor around back, once again joined by basic ultra-wide angle and macro shenanigans. Camera fans on a budget should also check out Xiaomi's latest trio of Redmi smartphones covering a range of budgets. the Redmi Note 12, 12 Pro and 12 Pro Plus. Those Pro models dish up a more powerful Dimensity chipset, plus faster battery charging, stereo speakers and some other benefits for a bit of extra cash. And to make things even more complicated, Xiaomi has packed completely different camera hardware into all three of these Redmi blowers. You got a 48 meg, possibly an OmniVision effort on the Redmi Note 12. That's upgraded to a 50 meg Sony IMX766 with optical image stabilization on the Pro. And then that's boosted again to a 200 meg Samsung HPX effort, again with OIS, on the Pro Plus. You essentially get the same camera app on all three, however, packed with all of the same features, including the good old reliable AI mode, which can determine what you're trying to take a snap of and then tweak the settings on your behalf. You got filters to piddle about with, timers, you can change up the aspect ratio. When it comes to the photo quality, well, here's some side-by-side samples I took on all three. They'll all do the job in a well-lit scenario. Even the regular Redmi Note 12 doesn't struggle too much with HDR style situations. The Redmi Note 12 Pro with that dependable IMX766 is definitely a step up though. And then when it comes to low light scenarios, that is where the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus really steps in with that 200 megapixel sensor. That pixel binning technology really brightening up your snaps even when the light is in scarce supply, so you get impressive levels of detail and tonal accuracy. So if you do find yourself out on the town a lot in the evenings, you'll definitely want to consider that Pro Plus. And of course the fact you've got the image stabilization on the Pro and the Pro Plus really helps out with those low light shots as well. And yeah, you got all the usual bonus camera modes packed on all three of these phones, including the portrait mode, complete with customizable bokeh action on the Pro and Pro Plus. If we jump into the more section, the Redmi Note 12 5G does have less options than the Pro versions, but you're only losing a couple of bits like the vlog mode and of course the long exposure mode, as you don't have the optical image stabilization. If you like to shoot lots of home movies on your smartphone, well, again, you might want to look at the Pro models as they top off at 4K resolution at 30 FPS. You've also got 1080p at 60 FPS option, whereas the regular bog standard Redmi Note 12 5G tops off at 1080p 30 FPS. And that regular Redmi Note 12 is fine for shooting simple, short, shareable clips as long as, again, the lighting isn't balls. But it's certainly the Pro models that do really, really well here, shooting some nice looking video, especially for this sort of price point. Respectable image stabilization, clear audio capture, the works. As for the other two lenses, well, they're identical on all three of these smartphones. You've got a basic 8 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter, which is good if you just want to fit a little bit more into frame, and a bog standard 2 megapixel macro lens, which is frankly pointless. And as for those front facing selfie cams, well, it is slightly different tech again. It's a 13 meg shooter on the Redmi Note 12 that gets upgraded to a 16 mega here on the Pro and Pro Plus. But all three do an okay job, even when the lighting is a bit dim or when you've got a really bright background to contend with, it's not too shabby. Another favourite of mine is the OnePlus Nord 2T, which once again sports a slick AMOLED screen, smooth everyday performance and dependable battery life. Slapped on that arse is yet another 50 megapixel Sony IMX766 camera sensor, and it's once again a good one in more circumstances. Most of my test photos look pretty natural, with vibrant colours when appropriate and enough sharp details so they look good on a proper big telly screen. The focus is fast to react and rarely messes up, even when the subject is in motion. At night, you still get attractive looking pics with that IMX766 sensor, even without employing OnePlus's dedicated nightscape mode. That's possibly helped along by the Dimensity processor's upgraded abilities. Things have to be really dim before you finally get some grain and ugly stuff creeping into your shots. Indoor snaps do tend to come out quite warm, but again with impressive detail considering they were spaffed out by a mid-range mobile. Oh, and by the way, you are very welcome for this here horrific nightmare fuel, which comes courtesy of that mental Google event. All I can say is thank God I was hammered by the time I shot these photos. Now, if anything in this camera setup needed upgrading, it is definitely that 8 megapixel ultra wide angle snapper. This is okay-ish for outdoor snaps with good lighting, although colours do look a bit wonky, and the results are pretty bloody dreadful once you move indoors or you try actually snapping stuff at night. You can also shoot up to 4K resolution video on the OnePlus Nord 2T, and this again does the job for your home movies, offering sharp detail, accurate colours more often than not, and strong enough stabilisation so your footage isn't reduced to a janky, shaky mess whenever you twitch your arm a bit. In lower light, things don't immediately look terrible, and the audio capture was good enough to clearly pick up and emphasise vocals both in front of and behind the camera. And finally, up front, you've got a 32 meg IMX615 sensor for shooting all of those lovely selfies, and this works fine in good light, but in more ambient conditions you will need a steady hand to avoid blur. a steady hand I clearly didn't have after quaffing too many random vodka and tequila cocktails. Now if that's still just a bit beyond your budget, well no worries, because OnePlus also recently released the cheaper yet still pretty ruddy effing marvellous Nord CE3 Lite. And this still rocks some very impressive specs for just 300 quid. Highlights include a crisp 120Hz display, a Snapdragon chipset that can still just about cope with games like Genshin Impact, and excellent battery life that'll last you all day, no worries. But one of the best bits is that 108MP rear camera, which punches above its weight at this price point. And again, if you've used a OnePlus smartphone before, you'll be right at home with the camera app. It's very easy to get on with, all of the usual toggles and various camera modes. And of course your obligatory bit of AI scene enhancement as well. And as I mentioned, I recently buggered off to South Korea and took the opportunity to snap lots of touristy pics with the Nord CE3 Lite. Here's a whole bunch of sample shots that I snapped using the Nord on my excursion. Those daytime shots, really impressed with their natural look and tones, and yes, even this garish gold Gangnam style statue was accurately captured. The Nord seemed to cope pretty well with strong contrast as well. These HDR style situations didn't put it off. And yeah, there's no telephoto lens here, but the Nord CE3 Lite offers 3 times lossless zoom thanks to the massive sensor. You could always just shoot a 108MP ultra high res pic and then crop in yourself. The more ambient conditions, the Nord CE3 Lite again seems to hold up pretty well. It uses 9-in-1 pixel binning to brighten things up, while the digital stabilization can counter hand tremors from a few too many Cass beers or sojus. And of course you've got the usual portrait shenanigans. If you're shooting a human subject, you can completely change up the bokeh effect. And you've got a handful of other camera modes packed away in the more section as well, including a good bit of pro action. So you can tweak the various settings before you shoot. And if you like to shoot home movies with your smartphone, well, this does top off at full HD resolution. There's no 4K option. And here again is just a small sample of the footage that I shot out in South Korea. As you can see, nice poppy colors when you're recording a vivid subject. The stabilization's pretty decent despite the lack of OIS. And even in the evenings, you'll get a respectable amount of detail packed in there. And then last up, that selfie cam is a 16MP shooter. Once again with the portrait mode where you can tweak the background blur effect. And this right here, ladies and gentlemen, is why I'm not on Instagram. Now Motorola usually serves up some decent camera tech for an affordable price. For instance, a snifter under 200 of your British pounds bags you the Moto G62, whose highlights include a crisp 6.5-inch 120Hz display and a mighty 5000 mAh battery, plus a pleasingly stock Android experience. Your primary sensor is a 50MP effort. You've got the usual Motorola AI smarts on board when you launch that camera app. This can just help you to get the best possible shot depending on obviously what your subject is. And for a £200 shooter, it's not bad at all. Of course, you'll have to make sure that your subject is well lit and as still as possible if they're not well lit. You get a reasonable amount of detail packed in there. There is a good bit of pixel binning going on, which just helps to brighten things up a little bit when the conditions aren't quite perfect. Now, as well as that 50MP primary sensor, you've also got an 8MP secondary ultra-wide angle shooter, which as you can see there offers a more pulled back view of the action. Don't expect as much detail in these pics, and of course the colors take a hit as well, but it's there if you want a different viewpoint. And when it comes to video recording as well, the Moto G62, again pretty limited. You don't have 4K resolution recording here, only full HD at either 30 or 60 frames per second. So don't expect your footage to be absolutely packed with detail. Things will look a bit grainy when beamed up to a big screen, but it's fine for simple shareable clips and everyday home movies. And then last up, flip around to the front and you've got a 16MP selfie shooter housed in that little orifice up top. And again, just be mindful when you're shooting selfies with the Moto G62 because there are limitations. Don't snap yourself against any super bright skies, for instance, and in particularly low light environments, it doesn't exactly thrive either. And yay, verily, you can shoot full HD resolution footage on the Moto G62 using that 16MP selfie snapper. Again, same limitations. You know, if you're doing it indoors, it's going to look a little bit grainy and cruddy if the lighting is particularly cack. The audio pickup seems absolutely fine though. If you can spare a bit more cash, the Moto G82 upgrades the display to an OLED panel while also improving the everyday performance. And that camera tech is mostly the same, but now the primary sensor has built-in optical image stabilization. Now 50MP primary sensor does a pretty decent job of everyday photos without balking the colors or, tweaking things too much. Fairly natural looking images, and even in quite strong contrast, it generally holds up pretty well. You get some little bits of saturation creeping in here and there, but nothing too dramatic. Of course, in more ambient light and lower light conditions, it does tend to struggle a little bit more. You get softer results, bit of noise and grain creeping in, but the optical image stabilization helps to keep things as sharp as possible. You do also have an ultra-wide angle shooter that you can swap to at any point. It's a basic 8 megapixel effort, and again, this does fine during the day, but struggles a little bit more in the evenings where you'll get murkier results. The disappointment here is that there's no support for 4K Ultra HD resolution footage. You've got Full HD plus video by default, and that can be shot at 30 or 60 frames per second, but that's it. And last up, around front in that little selfie orifice tucked away up at the top end of the screen there, you've got a 16 megapixel selfie shooter. This ain't bad at all for your everyday shareable, Instagrammable shots, whatever, if that's what you're into. Doesn't capture a huge amount of detail unless the lighting conditions are perfect, which in my case is actually pretty good. You can struggle a little bit in low light situations as well, but you do have a screen flash feature which is brighter than the sun, so that will help out when it's nighttime and also give you a tan at the same time. And for shooting video with that selfie snapper, well, no surprises that it is again topped off at Full HD resolution. There's no option of 30 or 60 frames per second. This time, audio pickup seems absolutely fine. Again, not great in the sort of lower light situations, but does the job. And finally, for around 300 quid, you can always grab the Nokia G60, which comes packing years of software support, some eco-friendly design, and a 50 megapixel primary camera sensor, although sadly without any OIS built in. Nokia was unfortunately a little bit vague when it comes to exactly which camera sensor has been used in the Nokia G60, but I do know there's no optical image stabilization packed in there. But you know what, I got some really good looking photos out of this thing, packed with enough sharp details so they looked good even on a proper big screen, particularly these portrait shots. Colours come out close to natural even when you're snapping quite vibrant subjects, and while strong contrast usually results in oversaturation, the Nokia G60 does hold up well compared with some of its rivals. Indoor snaps are often a bit grainy, but again nothing too horrific, although at night the Nokia G60 does struggle quite a bit, and while the night mode brightens things up considerably, it often can't help with the soft focus and noise. For a different kind of view, you can always swap to the basic 5 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter, and this is pretty basic stuff. It struggles in more testing conditions, but it's there if you need it. And that final lens slapped on the back of the Nokia G60 is just a depth sensor for those portrait shots. Now, if you swap on over to the video mode, you will quickly discover that there's no way of shooting 4K resolution footage here. It does max out at 1080p Full HD at either 30 or 60 FPS. And strong light will definitely need to be avoided at all times, otherwise the resultant footage will look, well, just like this right here really. Same goes for night video as well. Like most of the competition, this phone just kind of falls on its arse a bit. But in good lighting, you will get respectable looking video clips with decent audio pickup, and the stabilization ain't too bad either. And then last up is the 8 megapixel, I believe it is, selfie camera. This does a pretty good job in stronger light, making sure that your face is fully in focus with attractive portrait results if you want. But again, indoor shots will look rather soft, and at night everything gets a bit grainy. And there you have it, my lovelies. That in a tasty wee nutshell is my roundup of the very best budget-friendly camera smartphones you can bag yourself right now in 2023. Now, all of these smartphones I've personally tested and reviewed, but of course I may have missed out some of your own personal favorites that I haven't had a chance to get to, so definitely clue me in down in the comments below. Poke subscribe, ding that notifications bell, all the usual YouTube bollocks, and have yourselves a bloody wonderful rest of the week. Cheers everyone, love you!